Weddings are supposed to be about joy, not secrets. But when my granddaughter's face went pale in the middle of her mother's vows, I knew something ugly had surfaced. I never cared much for weddings. Too much pageantry, too much forced joy, too many speeches that sound borrowed from greeting cards. But when it's your daughter walking down the aisle, you go. That's just what fathers do, even when they're pushing 60 and their back aches from sitting too long in polished chairs. The reception hall was draped in gold and white, the kind of showy decoration people hire planners to arrange. Candles flickered in tall glass vases. A string quartet played softly near the altar. My daughter, beautiful in lace, her face lit up like she'd finally outrun years of bad luck, stood hand in hand with her groom. She looked happier than I'd seen her in decades. After her first marriage crumbled under the weight of lies and debts, I wanted this moment to be hers. I wanted it to last. But from the beginning, something felt off. I saw it in my granddaughter. Anna was 16 now, tall and elegant in a lavender dress that made her look older than her years. She was sitting near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone else she looked composed, but I know my family better than most. I saw the tightness around her mouth, the way her leg bounced under her chair. She was nervous. Not the kind of nervous that comes with seeing your mother remarry. This was different. It was sharp, tense, like she was holding something in. When the ceremony began, the room filled with that hushed reverence people always put on in weddings. The officiant spoke, the music swelled, and my daughter repeated her vows in a trembling voice that made half the guests dab their eyes. The groom answered with his own words, steady and practiced, as though he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. But as the words spilled from his mouth, I noticed Anna's face change. Her smile vanished. Her eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto him like he was a stranger. She leaned forward slightly, clutching the edge of her chair, her lips parting as though she wanted to shout but didn't dare. At first, I thought maybe it was teenage nerves. Weddings can stir up all kinds of feelings. But then her knuckles turned white against the chair, and her whole body trembled. Halfway through the vows, she couldn't take it anymore. Her chair screeched across the floor as she stood, the sound slicing through the soft music and reverent silence. Every head in the room turned at once. "I can't stay here," she whispered, though in the silence it felt like a scream. Her voice cracked, fragile but fierce. "I want to go. Grandpa, please take me home." The gasp that rolled through the hall was almost physical. My daughter's eyes went wide, her mouth opening and closing like she'd lost the ability to speak. The groom froze mid-sentence, his jaw slack, eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Shock? Guilt? I rose carefully, my knees aching, but my grip was steady when I reached for Anna's hand. She clutched me like she was drowning. Her eyes glistened, fixed not on me but on him, on the man her mother was about to marry. Behind me, whispers erupted like wildfire. "What's wrong? Why is she leaving? Did you see her face?" My daughter finally found her voice. "Anna!" she cried, desperation and embarrassment tangled in her tone. "What are you doing? Sit down!" But Anna didn't stop. She shook her head violently, tears spilling now. "No! I won't!" And then she looked at me, her grandfather, the man she trusted more than anyone else in that room, and said words I'll never forget. "Please, don't let him near me." The air left my lungs. My daughter staggered as though struck. The groom's face strained of color. The room, that glittering hall filled with flowers and laughter a moment ago, collapsed into chaos. I didn't ask questions. Not yet. I wrapped my arm around Anna and led her down the aisle as the guests' whispers turned to gasps and speculation. My daughter's voice followed us, pleading, demanding, breaking, but I didn't turn back. Because in that moment, in the terrified tremor of my granddaughter's words, I understood one thing: this wasn't just cold feet. This was betrayal. And the truth was about to tear my family apart. Secrets don't come out neat, they rip their way out in sobs, half-sentences, and trembling hands. And what my granddaughter told me outside that wedding froze my blood. We stepped out of the banquet hall into the cold November air, and for a moment I thought Anna was going to collapse. Her knees buckled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I tightened my grip on her shoulders, steering her away from the golden-lit windows and the stairs pressed against them like curious eyes from a zoo. "Easy, sweetheart," I murmured, my voice low and steady, though inside I felt like I was breaking apart. "Just breathe. You're safe now." She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks, mascara smudging into dark lines. I can't go back in there, Grandpa. Not with him. Please don't make me." I sat her down on a bench just outside the church garden, the cold wood biting even through my slacks. I draped my coat around her shoulders, though she was shaking too hard to notice. The sounds of the wedding filtered faintly through the glass doors, muffled voices, chairs scraping, confusion mounting. Behind us, the wind rustled through the bare trees, scattering brittle leaves across the path. "Anna," I said gently, lifting her chin so her eyes met mine. "What's going on? What did you see?" Her lips quivered. She clutched my coat like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. "It's him," she whispered. "Mom's fiancé. He's... Grandpa, I know him. Not from here. From before." A chill rippled down my spine. "Before what?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting as though afraid he'd suddenly appear. "Last summer, when Mom sent me to stay with her friend, remember? I was at their house, and he was there. Not as Mom's boyfriend, not then. He was just around." Her voice cracked. "He tried to touch me, Grandpa. He cornered me in the hallway one night. I ran before it went too far, but..." She broke off, burying her face in her hands. My stomach dropped into ice. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The golden glow of the wedding hall behind us now felt like the gates of hell, and inside my daughter stood hand in hand with a man who'd tried to prey on her child. "Why didn't you tell me before?" My voice came out hoarse, trembling with anger I could barely contain. Anna shook her head violently. "I tried to tell Mom. She didn't believe me. She said I misunderstood, that I must have imagined it. She said he'd never do something like that. She told me not to ruin things for her." I felt a fire ignite in my chest, hot enough to burn through my veins. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had dismissed her child's cry for help. And now, here we were, standing outside her wedding to that very same man. Anna clutched my sleeve. "Grandpa, you believe me, don't you? Please tell me you believe me." I cupped her face in my hands, looking into her tear-swollen eyes. "Of course I believe you," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. "I always will. And I swear to you, Anna, I will not let that man near you again." Her sobs broke into quiet hiccups, her body slowly easing against me. I held her tight, staring back at the glowing hall. Through the glass doors, I could see shapes moving, people talking, the whole ceremony in disarray. My daughter was in there, probably furious, humiliated, confused. And the groom, he was waiting, his mask of charm cracking now that his secret had been dragged into the light. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to just walk away with Anna and leave it at that. That man had to be exposed. My daughter needed to see the truth she'd ignored, and the guests needed to know who they just applauded for. I kissed Anna's forehead, smoothing back her hair. "Stay here," I said. "I'll be back." Her eyes widened in alarm. "Grandpa, don't." But I was already standing, straightening my jacket, my hands trembling not from age but from fury. Because when a man preys on family, revenge isn't an option. It's a duty. There are moments in life when silence is as deadly as a lie, and that night, I decided my silence was over. When I pushed back through those heavy glass doors, the reception hall felt different. The warmth of candles and string music had curdled into unease. Guests murmured in clusters, craning their necks toward the aisle where the ceremony had stalled. My daughter stood frozen near the altar, her veil trembling with each breath. The groom, The man who dared to stand beside her with vows of love on his lips had retreated a few steps, whispering furiously to the officiant as if a side conversation could fix what had just happened. All eyes turned when I entered. An older man leading his sobbing granddaughter out of a wedding is not something people forget. They expected me to slip back into my chair and pretend nothing had happened. But I hadn't carried Anna out of there just to hide in shadows. I walked down the aisle slowly, letting the sound of my shoes on the polished floor cut through the whispers. I didn't rush. I wanted every second to weigh heavy, each step to build pressure. By the time I reached the altar, the room was silent. Even the string quartet had stopped mid-song. My daughter looked at me, eyes red, makeup smudged. "Dad, what's going on? Why did she leave like that?" Her voice wavered between anger and desperation. She wanted answers, but she was terrified of them too. I turned my gaze on the groom. His mask of charm was cracking. The smile he'd always worn like armor was gone. Sweat glistened at his hairline, his jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grind. "You want to tell them," I said evenly, my voice carrying to the back of the hall. "Or should I?" The groom flinched but didn't answer. A murmur rippled through the guests, confusion giving way to suspicion. I turned back to the crowd. "My granddaughter left because she knows who this man really is. Months ago, he tried to put his hands on her. A child. My daughter's child." The gasp that followed was deafening. People shot to their feet. Some covered their mouths. Others shook their heads, muttering. My daughter staggered, her bouquet slipping from her hands and scattering petals across the floor. "That's not true!" the groom snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "She's lying. She misunderstood. Teenagers make things up." I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his. "Do you really want to go down that road? Call her a liar in front of all these people? Because I know my granddaughter. She doesn't lie. Not about something like this." He opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the guests, to the neighbors, the coworkers, the distant relatives, all of them staring at him with widening disgust. My daughter shook her head violently, her veil slipping sideways. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be true. Tell me it's not true." She looked at him, pleading, begging for a denial that might patch the hole ripping through her world. But denial couldn't cover the truth anymore. He stammered, stuttered, tried to string together words, but his voice betrayed him. And in that silence I knew. Everyone else knew too. I stepped back, my chest heaving with a controlled fury. "This wedding is over." The officiant froze, unsure whether to speak. Guests rose in a tide of whispers, some already filing toward the exits. My daughter collapsed into a chair sobbing, her hands pressed to her face. The groom tried to step toward her, reaching out a hand, but I blocked him. My body, though old and aching, became a wall of steel. "Don't you touch her. Don't you ever go near my family again." His face twisted with rage and desperation. But surrounded by 100 witnesses, there was nothing he could do. Security, or maybe just brave uncles emboldened by outrage, moved in to usher him out. He resisted, sputtering half-denials, curses, but the crowd swallowed him, pushing him out into the cold night where his lies belong. I stood at the altar, my hands trembling not from weakness but from the release of restraint. For too long, my granddaughter had carried that secret alone. For too long, my daughter had blinded herself to the truth. Now it was out in the open, raw and undeniable. The wedding was in ruins. But for the first time in months, Anna's voice had been heard. And I silently promised her that no matter what came next, I would make sure he paid for what he'd done. When the wedding crashed down around us, I learned something ugly and necessary. The first thing a man must do when a child's safety is at risk is stop being stunned and start being useful. They pushed him out into the cold like a bad thought finally being discarded. For a moment, the air after that roar of whispers felt almost clean. The candles still flickered, the music strings sagged, and my daughter sat in a ruined halo of tulle and flowers, her face a map of shock and disbelief. Anna was a small, shuddering thing in my arms, her hands clamped to my jacket as if she could hold herself together by clinging to me. I wanted to tear the hall down and throw its glitter in the trash. I wanted to drag that man back inside and make him answer in front of everyone he'd lied to. But fury is a poor architect of justice unless you shape it with facts and law. I kneeled in the mud of that moment and did what had to be done. First, safety. I led Anna out of the building, keeping the door between us and the press of faces. I could feel 100 stares on my back like needles, judgment and curiosity and the soft cruelty of people who love an upturned life more for gossip than compassion. Outside, the cold hit our cheeks and the night smelled of exhaust and cut grass and something raw. I wrapped her in my coat and sat on a low stone wall while she sobbed until her shoulders shook. I let her speak in halting pieces, a sentence here, a memory there, and I listened like a man learning the shape of a wound. She told me the night he'd cornered her in the hallway with the gleam of both hands on the banister. She told me the way he'd smiled afterward, as if nothing had happened. She told me she tried to tell her mother, and had been waved off with a kiss on the forehead, and a "You're imagining things." That last line hit me like a physical blow. My daughter had been robbed not just of truth but of the choice to act. I promised Anna then, with my hand on her shaking elbow, that nothing like that would happen again. I kept my promise by being methodical. We went straight to the nearest police substation. The receptionist blinked at us when I explained, "Weddings don't turn into police reports every day, but God bless that woman, she didn't blink twice." I made a statement, slow and precise, recounting what Anna had told me. Anna did the same, her voice a fragile thing at first, then steadier under the officer's patient prompting. I saw the shift happen in her, recognition that words spoken under oath gain weight. The cop took notes, asked the right questions, dates, times, descriptions. He told us he'd take our statement seriously, and would open an investigation. He suggested we go to the hospital to have Anna examined and photographed for evidence. I squeezed her hand and promised I'd be there every step. While the officers began the paperwork, I dialed people I knew could move things forward without drama. Elaine, my lawyer, answered in a voice that rarely betrays emotion. "Meet me at the emergency room," I said. Her response was immediate. "I'll be there. Don't let anything happen to that child." That was the kind of friend you pray to have when life becomes a mess of needles. I also called Frank and asked him to monitor the groom, not to threaten, not to fight, but to collect whatever he could in plain sight. The places the man went, who he worked for, whether he had a license plate on his truck that seemed familiar. Nothing illegal. Just sensible human reconnaissance. The hospital smelled antiseptic and grief. They treated Anna kindly, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, took photographs, drew blood for forensic testing, then sat us down in a small, fluorescent room where reality seemed to unfurl in stark lines. A rape kit would be done, a nurse explained, evidence would be catalogued, and a chain of custody would begin. We watched technicians move with careful, deliberate competence. I felt both infant and old man at the same time, furious at what had happened and grateful for the systems that existed to help us turn fear into a file that could be used in court. Back at the station, an investigator who smelled of cheap coffee and quiet competence took my details and Anna's statement again. He told us the first dangerous thing in cases like this was silence. The predator thrives on it. The second was disbelief. We had neither with us now. We had sworn statements, hospital notes, and witnesses who could say where the man had been that summer. The detective asked if Anna had told anyone else, and I said she had tried, but no one listened. He nodded and said softly, "We'll do what we can. We'll start with the report and then serve him with a protective order. If there's other evidence, we'll move to arrest." I didn't wait to be told what came next. Elaine and I drew up a temporary restraining order before the detective even left. I'd long ago learned what paperwork can do. It creates a leash for the unruly and a barrier for the vulnerable. Elaine's pen moved like a surgeon's instrument, precise, unromantic. She filled in names, dates, addresses. Within hours, we had legal ink that would require him to stay away from Anna, to surrender any firearms, and to avoid the house. The judge signed it that afternoon. The court clerk stamped it. When the sheriff's deputy handed the groom his copy that evening at his workplace, a shabby office that did not match the polished suit he'd worn at the altar, his face folded into a dozen colors. There was fear there then, a real, human fear that justice might actually be more than a rumor. While courts and cops moved, I did the quieter work. I gathered proof of his appearances, photographs Anna remembered, messages she had screenshotted, the name of the friend's house where the incident had occurred. Frank found a neighbor who remembered seeing the man sprinting from the property once in the night, and another person who'd heard an argument but thought it domestic. These were not theatrical pieces of evidence. They were the small things that, collected like fragments, form a case. I compiled them in a folder, labeled them, and gave copies to the detective and to Elaine. We didn't publicize the story beyond that for Anna's sake. This was legal work, not spectacle. At home that night, after Anna was tucked into bed with a glass of warm milk and her favorite blanket, I sat with my daughter, and we spoke in the terrible way of people who discover their own blindness. She wept then, not only for her daughter's violation but for the sharp cruelty of knowing she had dismissed a child's terror. I didn't comfort with platitudes. I offered a steady presence and practical plans, therapy for Anna, legal action, and a family meeting when she was ready. The anger in me was not for show, it was fuel. I promised my daughter I would not let this rest. I promised Anna I would be the kind of man who keeps promises when the world tries to deny them. There's a kind of revenge that is simple and lawful. It is the removal of opportunity. We tightened the circle around that man so he could not walk back into our life unnoticed. We had cops who could arrest him if he violated the order. We had medical and forensic reports that made a prosecutor take the case seriously. We had friends who would testify to his presence and to his strange behavior that summer. All of these things are technical and boring, and yet they are how you stop a predator, not with a yell but with a chain of custody and a judge's signature. Still, I'm not a man who leaves things purely to institutions. I kept an eye on the neighborhood, asked questions at the corners where people gossip responsibly, and pressed gently on every kindness that would help Anna heal. There will be hearings, depositions, and a long river of paperwork yet to run. There will also be anger, and grief, and a long work of rebuilding my daughter's trust in herself and in the people who should protect her. As I lay awake that night, the house finally quiet, I thought about the vow, real revenge, not the petty sort, but the kind that severs a predator from his prey. I would make sure the man who tried to touch my granddaughter paid in the only currency that matters in a lawful society. His actions would have consequences that followed him whether he liked it or not. And when morning came, I had the first concrete plan: meet with the detective, follow every lead, and make sure Anna's voice was the centerpiece of our case, not the hushed, ashamed whisper someone else could sweep away. That was the start. The next part would be harder, turning the evidence we had into a line of questioning that would stick in a prosecutor's mind. But for the first time since she'd stood up in that hall, Anna's shoulders looked less like they would break. That was victory enough for one night. Hook for Part 5. The grandfather moves from protection to prosecution, tracking the groom's past, corroborating Anna's story, and discovering the reputation and lies that allowed him to get this far. When you want to catch a liar, you don't yell at him. You follow the tiny, stubborn threads he leaves behind until they tangle him up. That's what I set out to do. I never fancied myself a detective, but after the hospital and the police and the judge's signature that kept that man away from Anna, there was work left that only stubbornness and time could do. The investigators did their part, statements, medical reports, the judge's order, but bureaucracy moves like an old machine, steady, necessary, and slow. My job, I decided, would be to move faster in the places bureaucracy can't, the neighborhoods where people knew things they wouldn't volunteer to a uniform, the corners of the internet where boasts and slips live forever, and the little memory holes in the groom's life where his story didn't line up. I started the morning after the restraining order by making a coffee so strong it might have walked me back to my 20s. Then I opened the folder I'd begun at the hospital, Photos, dates, names Anna remembered, fragments of text messages she'd captured. Evidence is a patient animal. You keep it in one place and watch it. I added a post-it to the top, follow every small thing. That became my working motto. First stop was the friend's house Anna had mentioned, the one where the incident happened that summer. Anna had described the place by a crooked mailbox and a rusted gate. Frank had a knack for spotting details ordinary folks miss, so I called him and asked if he wouldn't mind driving me by. He came 10 minutes later with 2 thermoses and a cigarette behind his ear. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. The house looked smaller than I'd pictured. A porch sagged like it was carrying a secret, and spray paint had been used in an amateur mural on the side fence. A woman watered plants out front. She glanced at us, wary. I introduced myself carefully, a rough, neighborly version of charm, and let the woman warm up. Her name was Maria. She'd seen the groom before. He'd stopped by months ago asking about a job, she said, and lingered too long on the porch. Nothing dramatic, she insisted, but her eyes told me she'd noticed oddness. Small things add up. She told me about a night she heard hurried footsteps, and later, a car leaving fast, details that matched Anna's memory of one hurried escape. I thanked her and left her my number. People like Maria don't always want the police in their yards. They do, though, sometimes tell old men knitting facts on the street. Next, I dug into the groom's online life. You can learn a lot about a man from how he brags. His social profiles were a landscape of carefully curated affirmations, photos at charity events, staged shots by some lake, neatly captioned posts about new beginnings and family values. But beneath the sheen, comments and tagged friends left breadcrumbs. A photo from last summer had him tagged in a group of people at a barbecue. One commenter jokingly called him Red, and another mentioned a weekend at Pine Ridge. I printed everything. If he was a chameleon in person, he left scales online. I also called the groom's old workplace. He claimed to be a manager at a small remodeling firm, but when I asked around, politely, not accusatorially, the story bent. A former coworker told me the man bounced between jobs. Every few months he'd move on, leaving unpaid tabs and a row of offended supervisors. A pattern of charm, quick fixes, and fast exits. I wrote it down in my notebook. Pattern, leaves, then legacy of unpaid debts/grudges. That's the behavior of men who will use charm to mask predation, if they can. The detective appreciated the neighborhood reports, I could tell. He called the morning I took Maria's number, and asked me to keep a log of anything new. "Good work, Mr. Hargrove," he said gruffly. "Your granddaughter's statement is strong, but corroboration helps us turn a story into a case." I told him I was happy to help. The word happy tasted strange and unearned in my mouth, but I meant it. You do anything for your family when you're the last one left standing in front of the storm. Next, I reached out carefully to women who might have had passing contact with the groom. I didn't want to harass anyone or make wild accusations, so I phrased things as checks. "Did you ever work with a man named?" One woman who'd hired him briefly for a morning repair recalled odd behavior, a hand on a shoulder that lingered too long, a question that sounded like a test. She'd shrugged it off at the time. People shrug off predators a lot. After a while it's easier to pretend it was nothing than face the truth. I also used the old approach that had gotten me through factory mischief for 30 years, favors. There are people in a town who can make a call and get a record pulled, and they do it because you once bought their kid work boots or covered a shift. I called an old friend who works in county records and asked for a simple pull of the groom's name, past addresses, prior complaints, any civil suits. A small fee, a coffee, and a memory repaid. There it was, a small civil suit 3 years back about unpaid services, and a landlord complaint about noise. Not violent crimes, but the same pattern of a man who left problems in his wake. It fit a shape we were building. As the pieces accumulated, I organized them with the methodical nudging of a man who'd paid suppliers and balanced ledgers for decades. Dates matched. A Protestant's righteousness glazed my methodical hands. Every bit of corroboration thickened our packet. I made copies for the detective and for Elaine. The prosecutor needed threads, not lightning bolts, to make an arrest stick. Evidence is patient. It waits for you to stitch it into a scene that can hold. Midweek, the detective called to say they'd interviewed a woman in the next town who'd reported harassment earlier the year before. She hadn't filed anything then. Who blames her? But seeing a new report had nudged her to share. Her statement fit: a man who approached women at neighborhood events, a man who used charm until he could isolate someone. It wasn't the exact same act Anna described, but it was a pattern. Pattern matters. Patterns allow a prosecutor to argue likelihood and motive. There was a dark little corner of this work I hadn't anticipated: the groom's references. He presented himself at the wedding as a stable man with a steady job and parents who'd spoken warmly of him. I called the parents listed on his references, and one of them said the name sounded familiar but then grew evasive. By the third call, I realized he'd invented a family for himself in small-town parlance, a set of people who'd be impressed by a tailored suit and a rehearsed vow. That explained his comfort among strangers. He'd built a persona and moved through doors where people accepted it at face value. Where a real man has roots, he had rehearsals. I kept my voice even when I reported each finding to my daughter. The truth had bruised her enough. She needed facts more than fury. When I handed her printed copies of claims and statements, she read in silence, then looked up with a face clean raw by years of denial. "How did I miss it?" she asked once, to the ceiling, to a memory of being young and hungry for a good man. I didn't answer with platitudes. I told her we were building a case, that denial was common, and that our job now was to make sure she and Anna were safe and heard. The small victories came. Another neighbor recalled seeing him at a motel in the next county one night last summer, unexplained, sudden, and a little furtive. Anna remembered the name of a bar where he'd bragged about his weekend errands. I called the bar, and a bartender, shifting partners with me over decades, remembered him and gave us the time he'd been there. Small corroborations, dates, places, eyewitnesses, make a mosaic of truth. It's slow, but it's relentless. One evening I sat at my kitchen table, the folder now tacked with post-its and yellow flags, and I thought about why men like him can flourish for a while. It's because they're patient manipulators who depend on people's kindness and the social cost of accusation. They know most victims won't be believed, they count on it. But they forget one thing: families, even fractured ones, can get very loud when they decide to be. The detective told me they were ready to approach the prosecutor with our collected material. It wasn't an overnight guarantee of justice, and I knew the courtroom is a messy place where truth sometimes stumbles, but we had what we needed to make them pay attention. I slept that night with the folder by my bed like a talisman. I'd started this work angry, raw, a man who wanted to crush a monster. But in the act of gathering, of talking to strangers and coaxing memories out of embarrassed neighbors, something else happened. My anger turned into a blueprint. I wasn't just out for revenge. I wanted prevention. I wanted the man removed from a pattern that could repeat elsewhere. I wanted my granddaughter to know that she'd been believed and that the world could be made to listen. The last call that night was to Anna. She'd been quieter lately, measuring how much she trusted me to do something that would change everything. "Grandpa?" she said when she answered. Her voice had that fragile steadiness that comes after a long cry. "Anything?" she asked. "Something," I told her. "I've found people who'll say what they saw. The police are compiling everything. We're making a net." I could hear a small, relieved inhale on the line. "Will he hurt anyone else?" she asked. "No," I said without hesitation. "Not if I can help it. Not on my watch." And we both knew that the work would be long: interviews, hearings, depositions, but the threads I'd pulled were coming together. The liar had met his match not in a single shout, but in a slow, stubborn following of evidence. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast. It was necessary. The fight against a liar isn't straight. Some days you think you've built a fortress, and then one rumor slides under the door like smoke, and suddenly the walls feel thin. The weeks after we brought the evidence to the prosecutor were the hardest. I had thought, foolishly, that once we had Anna's testimony, the medical report, and the corroborating details, the case would march forward like clockwork. Instead, the defense did what defense lawyers always do: they poked holes, spun motives, and spread whispers where the law could not reach. That was when the gossip began. It trickled out of the courthouse like a leak in the roof and soon was everywhere: at the grocery store, in church pews, over coffee cups in kitchens that weren't ours. Maybe Anna misunderstood. Maybe she exaggerated. Doubt became a contagion, and neighbors carried it as carelessly as a cold. One afternoon, my daughter came home shaking. A so-called friend had told her flat out, "Maybe Anna's just confused." Hearing it secondhand was almost worse than hearing it in court. She sat at our table, a mug of tea cooling untouched in her hands. "What if they don't believe her?" she whispered. "What if this all falls apart?" I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I spread out the folder on the table: receipts, witness names, the restraining order with the judge's signature. "This is not imagination," I said. "This is fact. Doubt is his weapon. Don't sharpen it for him." Still, I'll admit, at night, doubt crept into me too. I'd lie awake, asking myself whether a jury would see Anna's courage or dismiss it as teenage drama. Would his practiced charm outshine her trembling honesty? More than once I paced the hallway until my knees ached, the house dark except for the glow of a street light in the window. But the difference was this: Anna wasn't shrinking anymore. She'd started keeping a journal, writing down every detail she could remember from that summer: the banister she gripped in the hallway, the cologne he wore, the words he whispered when he thought no one would hear. Painful work, but powerful. When she handed me one entry, her handwriting shaky but determined, I knew she was building her own wall of truth, one brick at a time. One evening, my daughter joined us on the porch. She turned to Anna, tears in her eyes, and said softly, "I believe you now. I believe you with my whole heart." It wasn't a perfect redemption, the past still hung between them, but it was a start. Anna's shoulders loosened just a little, as if one corner of the burden had been lifted. And that was when I realized: doubt will always come, whispered in kitchens, shouted in courtrooms, carried in the backs of people who'd rather not face the truth. But as long as Anna had her voice, her journal, and her family standing steady, doubt couldn't win. If you want to break a liar, you don't shout, you build a case. You turn whispers into paper, late-night recollections into sworn statements, and then you wait for the knock that means the law has finally caught up. I won't pretend I enjoyed the paperwork. There's something about piles of photocopies and timestamps that steals the romance out of revenge and puts a slow, relentless logic in its place. But after Anna stood up in that hall and the hospital lights and the judge's stamp, the fight had turned from a personal fury into a procession of forms and phone calls, and I found I liked the rhythm of it. It felt like putting a rope around the right neck. The detective told me we'd done well to gather witnesses and receipts. "Pattern," he said as if the word were a talisman, and I came to love that word. Pattern is what lets prosecutors weigh probabilities. Pattern is what turns one person's testimony into a chorus that can't be ignored. We took our folder to the county prosecutor's office on a gray Wednesday. I remember the lobby: linoleum that squeaks when you walk too fast, the scent of coffee and government paper, because I kept glancing at the folder in my hands as if it might suddenly betray me. Elaine came too. She had that look lawyers get when they've already mapped the chessboard. The prosecutor was a woman who spoke quickly and with no nonsense. She read through the packet while I sat stiff as a fence post. Anna sat next to me, small in a borrowed jacket, clinging to the sleeve of my coat like it was a lifeline. "Your evidence is corroborative," she said finally. "We can file charges. Harassment, attempted sexual assault, and if the medical report supports it, we'll include that. It's messy, but it's strong enough for an indictment." She used words professionals use to measure human ruin and somehow made it sound administrative. A man on the news would have said she was efficient. I thought she was a small miracle. Filing charges brings things out into the open. It brings interviews with detectives, statements under oath, And then it brings the most uncomfortable thing of all, waiting. The arraignment notice came by mail a week later, a plain envelope that felt heavier than the rock in my chest. The man who tried to touch my granddaughter would be brought before a judge and required to answer. The word, indictment, sat in my head like a line of bricks, a wall I could see forming between our family and his lies. The day of the arraignment, I dressed in my Sunday jacket. Those Sundays felt far away. Anna sat with us in the front row of an ancient courtroom that smelled like old wood and stale coffee. The room was smaller than I expected. Justice always is, intimate, bureaucratic, unglamorous. When the defendant was brought in, he looked like any man who's been surprised by the calendar. He had the same tailored suit from the ruined wedding, but it hung oddly now, as if the clothes had been made for the story he wanted instead of the one he'd lived. Seeing him in that room, not as a charming stranger but as a man whose name might now be on a file, whose movements could be restricted by a judge's gavel, was the first small victory. He pleaded not guilty, of course. That's what men with rehearsed lies do, they insist on the stage even as it burns. The judge set conditions: stay away from Anna, no contact, and surrender any firearms. The deputy read them out like a script that ends a scene and begins a trial. After the hearing, as we walked out into the courthouse sunlight, people in crosswalks didn't know what had gone on behind those doors. To them it was just another small part of the news of the day. To me it was the sound of a door clicking shut on one of the darker corners of my life. That week the whispers swelled into conversations. The neighborhood held its breath, and the gossip bearers fell silent for a time, displaced by the gravity of court papers. My daughter, who'd once brushed off Anna's fear, sat with me in the kitchen at midnight and cried in a way you only do when you feel like you've seen something terrible in the mirror of your own choices. She apologized. Her apology was raw and earnest, and I took it because apologies are a start. Anna needed that, even if the wound would take years to settle. The prosecutor pushed for more corroboration: phone logs, bar receipts, motel registries. I had a little of it, and with the county records Elaine had managed, we had enough to show the man's pattern of transient jobs and abrupt departures. I tracked down one more witness, a woman in the diner who'd seen him late last spring, leaving with his car headlights like a guilty wink. She came forward with reluctance but with a steady voice. Each new corroboration felt less like vengeance and more like building a climate where the truth could breathe. There were hard nights when doubt crept in. The man's defense lawyer made his motion to suppress evidence on shaky technical grounds. The judge had to consider chain of custody details and whether a file had been compiled properly. Elaine and I sat through hearings where legalese felt like a codified nuisance. The law, being careful to avoid miscarriages, also buys time for cunning men. We spent hours with detectives retracing interviews, making sure each signature was proper, each timestamp defensible. It was tedious. It was necessary. Then came the arrest. I will never forget the phone call from Detective Ruiz. He slipped up. He grunted into the receiver. Warehouse District, midnight. We got him. I drove like a man who'd been given a second chance at something sacred. At the precinct he sat with his head bowed, not because of contrition but perhaps calculation, waiting for the next card to play. They booked him, took his prints, his photograph, the alkaline hum of fluorescent lights making everything feel final. I watched him go through the metal gate, then I watched Anna breathe a little easier, as if one heavy thing had been lifted from her shoulders. Courtroom drama is nothing like TV. There are continuances, delays, motions, and cross-claims. But as the process unfolded, something else happened in our house, a slow stitching back together. My daughter enrolled Anna in therapy and began to unlearn the habit of disbelief. She went to meetings with Elaine and with a victim advocate who helped her see how abused wives can sometimes collude with good men who are not what they appear. My role as the stubborn grandfather shifted slightly. I listened more and planned less, offering presence like a steady stone. When the trial finally came, the gallery was full of neighbors, some with soft, shameful looks on their faces, others with the distant pity people reserve for those who finally let a wrong be righted. Anna testified. That day she was not the frightened girl in the wedding hall. she was steady, a young woman face to face with the thing that had threatened her. Her voice sometimes trembled, but she did not break. She recited dates, small details, the texture of a hallway banister she'd gripped when she fled. The prosecutor guided her like a careful pilot through rough air. The defense tried to unpick stitches with sarcasm and insinuation. But the jury, ordinary people tasked with weighing ordinary truths, listened. When the verdict came, I didn't allow myself to imagine it. I'd learned in a life of scaffolding and hard shifts that certainty is brittle until you hold it in your hand. The jury returned a verdict that made a sound in the courtroom like rain finally beginning on a parched field. Guilty on the counts that mattered. There was a moment of legal silence. The man's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been placed upon him, and then the judge said a sentence that would keep him away long enough for healing to begin to matter. It wasn't revenge in the way I'd once pictured it. It was consequence. It was the law doing what the law does best, attach behavior to accountability. Afterward, people said things. Neighbors nodded with a kind of careful respect. My daughter and Anna hugged with a fierceness that stitched something raw back into place. I sat on the porch the night after the sentence, and felt the cold like a bomb. I'd wanted to make him pay, yes, but more than that I'd wanted to make my granddaughter safe and believed. Revenge had changed shape along the way. It went from an instinct to a plan to an orchestration of testimony and papers and quiet phone calls. And in the end, the music I liked best wasn't the clatter of punishment, it was the small, ordinary sound of a girl laughing again in the kitchen, of a mother sitting by her child at night, eyes open and watchful. That was justice to me, not the spectacle of ruin but the careful, bureaucratic work that keeps predators from confidence. When Anna fell asleep that night with her head on my lap, I thought of the knock that told us the law had entered the game. I thought of the slow building of facts that made that knock possible. And I felt, for the first time in a long while, that a promise kept can be a kind of mercy, and a kind of revenge that actually heals. You think the hardest part is the shout that brings a liar down. You're wrong. The hardest part is living in the rubble afterward, rebuilding a family, keeping a child safe, and deciding what to do with the anger you carry. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of small mercies the day the verdict came down, clerks shuffling papers, the judge's tap like a metronome calling time on a bad song, neighbors packed into the gallery with faces that looked chastened and curious at the same time. When the jury read guilty, someone in the third row made a sound that wasn't exactly a sob and wasn't exactly a laugh. It was relief that tasted a little like late rain. Anna's hand found mine in the pew. She squeezed once, hard. That was the first time I let myself breathe. But the legal box checked, the man behind bars. That didn't mean the work was over. You don't win this fight in a courtroom and then get to walk away unmarked. Justice had done the official part. Now life would do the harder, quieter part. Healing and, if I'm honest, my own unglamorous appetite for making sure consequences stuck. The days after the sentence were a strange weave of normal and surreal. Family life crept back in like a careful tide. Anna went to therapy twice a week and finally, she started sleeping through the night again without waking in a fog of panic. The therapist gave her tools, breathing techniques, a way to ground herself when intrusive memories threatened to take hold. I learned those exercises too and practiced them with her. There's something sacred and slightly ridiculous about a 60-year-old man humming while counting breaths on the porch with his granddaughter, but I'd have hummed louder if it helped. My daughter's remorse was a raw thing. She apologized in ways that sounded like a confession and a plea, sometimes practical, sometimes broken. I should have listened, she said over and over, as if repeating it would change the past. I don't live for platitudes anymore. I live to fix things that can be fixed. So we fixed the present, family meetings, rules about dates and visitors, clear lines about who can stay overnight. We redrew the map of our home life so there were gates against any man like that ever sneaking in again. Revenge, I discovered, is not a single full-minute act. It spreads outward like heat from a small iron left in one spot. I turned to that heat and learned where to press. I kept an eye on the man's network, the people he'd padded his stories with, the jobs he'd used as cover. With the detective's help, we traced a pattern of small cons and false names. I called a few of his past employers, places where he'd puffed himself up. One by one, the fabric of his good guy act unraveled. Men he'd burned turned out to have receipts. A landlord we contacted had a folder thicker than a Bible of complaints, bounced checks, evasive promises, a trail of people who'd been wronged. I turned those receipts over to the prosecutor's office. The criminal conviction was the law's work. This was the kind of reputational unmasking that keeps predators from slithering into new lives under fresh names. The neighborhood watched and learned. People who had shrugged before about an odd remark or a late-night visitor started to speak with more care. I found myself at the grocery store being asked, in those low voices people use for danger talk, how they could better protect their kids. I gave them the same advice Detective Rees had given me: pay attention, document things, believe the child first. It felt a little silly to be dispensing wisdom I'd learned the hard way, but if my late-in-the-day experience saved one kid from fear, I didn't begrudge the role. There were smaller, meaner satisfactions too. I called the references he'd given for the wedding and left messages with copies of the indictment, carefully factual, not gloating. A few of those supposed aunties and former bosses tightened their tone the way people do when their reputations might be implicated. The truth has a way of sliding under the carpet and showing everyone the dust it hides. That truth cost him friends and work opportunities. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the sound of those doors closing quietly. But I didn't want to become a man who celebrated ruin. I kept reminding myself of the line between justice and cruelty. My measures stayed practical: block his known associates from reaching out to Anna, alert his previous employers to check references, and make sure any parole conditions were strict and watched. I had the prosecutor on speed dial for a month. Maybe that sounds petty, but people underestimate the power of annoying the people who hurt your family. Officiating consequences doesn't always require fireworks, just a stubbornness that can't be silenced. We rebuilt routines. Saturday mornings were for pancakes and a skateboard lesson out front. Anna taught me how to steady the board while she wobbled into pride. The old things: soccer games, book clubs, phone calls with my daughter where we compared notes, became stitches binding the family back together. We made a ritual of dignity. Sunday dinners where no phones were allowed at the table and everyone had to contribute something honest. It wasn't therapy in the psychologist's sense, but it was therapy in the human one. Repetitive acts of care that say, every week you are seen. Still, nights were sometimes long. Old anger returns in the dark, the kind that tastes metallic and starts you pacing floors you thought you'd worn smooth. I found ways to channel it that didn't end in chain reaction. I volunteered at the community center, fixing a leaky roof, teaching a basic carpentry class to teenagers. There's healing in work that builds instead of destroying. The hammer doesn't always have to be a weapon, it can be a tool for repair. There were moments that surprised me. My daughter, who'd once been so eager to erase the past, began to volunteer at the hospital's support group for families of victims. She spoke in the soft, crumbly voice of someone who'd learned a lesson the hard way. It was humbling to watch her step into that light. She wasn't doing it for forgiveness, she was doing it because she had a child who needed an advocate, and because she'd learned the cost of not listening. And life, eventually, returned to a steady rhythm. The garden needed weeding, the roof needed a patch, and a science fair project needed glitter and handhold for the glue gun. Small things, yes, but small things add up to safety. The man in prison could no longer use charm as camouflage. The law had taken its slice, and society, nudged by a stubborn grandfather and a reluctant mother, had closed a few doors that might have otherwise stayed open. Sometimes, late at night, I look at old photos, my daughter blowing out candles at 8, Anna with her first lost tooth, me younger, blunter, still figuring things out. I think about the bitterness I felt at the wedding and how it transformed into a force that, if aimed right, can protect rather than simply punish. I think about justice and mercy as two sides of a toolbox. You need both. You must know when to use which. There are no cinematic endings here. The man will serve his time and then perhaps try to weave his way back into the world with a new face. That's the part where vigilance matters. We stay alert, not because we enjoy the shadow, but because we loved a girl enough to make a mess of things so she could be safe. That decision, to act rather than to rage quietly, is the part one am proudest of. It is the revenge that mattered, not the ruin of one man alone, but the reclamation of a family's dignity, and the rebuilding of a child's right to grow without fear. When Anna climbs into bed now, she tells me about her day, about a boy in science class who made a clever model volcano, about how she's thinking of trying out for the school play. She laughs about small things and cries only about the ones that matter. Once in a while she squeezes my hand in the middle of a sentence and says, like a benediction, "Thanks, Grandpa." Those 2 words carry a weight I carry like armor. If there is a lesson in all this, it's simple and maybe a little old-fashioned. Show up, do the hard things no one else will, and document everything. Fight the long bureaucratic battle with the same stubbornness you'd use to hang a shelf straight. And when the dust settles, choose the work of rebuilding over the work of revenge. The latter gets headlines. The former gives a girl her nights back. Revenge isn't fire and fury. It isn't the slam of a gavel or the clang of prison doors. True revenge is quieter. It's the sound of your family laughing again while the one who hurt them fades into nothing. The day the judge handed down the sentence, some people expected me to celebrate. Toast in the courthouse hallway, maybe. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt bone-deep tired, the kind of tired you only get after carrying someone else's fear for too long. At home, life began to stitch itself back together. Anna slept through the night more often. Therapy gave her tools to breathe when memories crept in. Sometimes I sat beside her on the porch, humming along as she counted breaths, a 60-year-old man humming like a fool, but if it helped her, I'd have sung louder. My daughter, too, began to change. Her apologies stopped being floods of guilt and became quiet acts of presence, walking Anna to therapy, cooking her favorite meals, sitting with her through silence. She was learning that being a mother meant listening with both ears open. We created new routines, Saturday pancakes, Sunday dinners, small rituals that reminded Anna this house was hers, safe and steady. But one night, we did something different. I pulled the ruined wedding invitation from the back of a drawer. Anna watched as I struck a match. The paper curled, blackened, and dropped into ash. She smiled, not a triumphant smile, but one of release. The past was only paper now. It could burn. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about destroying a man in a courtroom. It was about making sure he could never touch us again, not with his hands, not with his lies, not even with the shadow of his memory. And in the glow of that fire, watching Anna's shoulders lighten, I finally understood, the best revenge isn't ruin. It's reclamation. It's giving back what he tried to steal, her safety, her dignity, her laughter. It's one thing to see a man sentenced by strangers in robes. It's another to sit at your own table, staring at the cracks in your family, and decide whether you'll live with bitterness or with resolve. The trial was over. The gavel had fallen. The predator sat in a cell where his charm meant nothing. But the real work began afterward, when the courthouse echoes died and we were left with silence. Anna still moved carefully at first, like she was learning to carry her body again. Therapy and small rituals helped. Cocoa at night, long walks with me where we didn't always talk but where she knew she was safe. Safety, I realized, is a language spoken not in promises but in presence. My daughter bore her shame like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. She tried apologizing in waves, but one night I stopped her. Anna doesn't need you to drown her in apologies. She needs you to stand beside her now. Slowly she did. Their bond began to stitch itself together, not perfectly, but strong enough to hold. As for me, I kept my watch. I checked prison registries, made sure the protective order stayed active. Revenge was no longer about rage, it was vigilance, making damn sure he could never slip back into our lives. But what surprised me most was how peace crept in quietly. It came in the sound of Anna's laughter drifting from the kitchen, in the way my daughter leaned in to listen instead of brushing her off. It came in small acts of rebuilding that meant more than any verdict. One evening, I found Anna in the driveway with her old bike. The chain was off, the tires flat. "Think we can fix it?" she asked. We worked side by side, me tightening bolts, her pumping air into the tires. When she finally climbed on and pedaled down the street, wobbling, her laughter rang out into the dusk. I stood there watching, and I thought of the promise I'd made her outside that ruined wedding: "I will not let that man near you again." I had kept that promise. And in that moment, as her silhouette disappeared down the street, I understood: true revenge isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about protecting the people you love so fiercely that no enemy can touch them. That was the only vow that mattered, the promise kept. That was my story. Now I'd like to hear yours. Share it in the comments below.